Kristin Hannah, welcome to the Right About Now podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
You are such a great writer. I'm so excited to talk to you. I have a million questions. But thank you for doing what you do. So you've read this book that I just read, The Four Winds. This is your 24th book.
I think so. Yeah.
I mean, you're really good when you even lose track of how many
yes.
of how many books you've written.
Quite a few. Yes.
It's interesting. So when we're doing this interview, we're in the middle of this crisis in Texas with this snowstorm, and with the weather is just crazy, sub-zero and all this. And I couldn't help but think they're having a sort of once in a generation weather moment. And Four Winds is also set in Texas, previous century, in a once in a generation weather moment during the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. Are there any similarities? I mean, you must have done so much research into that time. Do you see any similarities?
Well, obviously, I am certainly not enough of a genius to have seen, how relevant this book was going to feel in, 2020 and 2021. But the genesis of the book was partially climate issues, and the Dust Bowl is considered the greatest environmental disaster of the last century, and it was partially man-made and sort of partially man-solved. So I think that as always, history has a lot to teach us, and one of the things it teaches us over and over again is that the same things keep happening in slightly different ways. And, it falls on us to learn from those stories and to pass those stories along to our children so that hopefully we can do better the next time something unforeseen happens.
Yeah. Were there, in your research, did you find there were sort of climate change, even back then, people talking about environmental issues, and then on the reverse side, people saying, well, this is not, man-made, this is a natural, like even
Right.
back then in the 30s?
Well, sure. I mean, with regard to the Dust Bowl in particular, which is a time period of about 4 years in the Great Plains, which is the Texas Panhandle, Oklahoma, Colorado, Kansas, that area. What happened was the post-World War I, wheat prices went crazy. And land was cheap. So people bought up a ton of land in the Great Plains and, tore up all the buffalo grass and planted wheat and planted corn. And while the rains came, it was great. Everybody was, rolling in money and doing very well. And then in the mid 30s, when the drought hit, and this drought lasted for 4.5 years, and the wind, is part of the climate of the Great Plains. It moves through there a great deal. And so when the windstorms started to hit, there was no root system to hold the soil in place. And so, great swaths of it were, picked up and blown across the country. It landed as far away as Washington, D.C., the soil from the Great Plains. And FDR had a man named Hugh Bennett. And he went around to the farmers and said, part of this is the way you farm. And
that was in the book.
You need to learn to farm differently. And of course, there was a lot of resistance to this idea, both that they had helped to cause it because they love their land, they never would have done that knowingly, and that they needed to change. Humans don't like to change their behavior, certainly not, based on sort of government information.
Yes, Americans don't like that so much.
No, and it ultimately it changed, and the rains came back, and it became a good farming area again.
So, like we've mentioned, you set this book in the Dust Bowl era of the 1930s, and I'm curious why you chose to set a book during this time. I think it might be intimidating for a lot of writers, actually, because there is a great epic book called The Grapes of Wrath that, it's kind of like, I was thinking like it's the equivalent of saying, I'm going to write a book about whaling, in off of Nantucket right. There's like certain books that are such American masterpieces. Were you at all intimidated to kind of go to that time and that period, since there's such a, famous book that
Iconic.
yeah.
Of course, as a writer, I was terrified. And I knew that there was no doubt that if I took on this time period, and specifically the California, sort of migrant
Migration.
and farmers experience, that if I took that on, I was running the risk of being compared. And, the chances of being compared favorably to the Grapes of Wrath felt pretty small to me. But the more I sort of thought about it, and the more I looked at the whole thing, I realized sort of that it's a very male perspective, and I am interested these days in really sort of reinserting women back into the national historical narrative, and that there was an experience to talk about, that there was a story here that was treading the same ground as the Grapes of Wrath, but bringing something new to the conversation.
Yep. And it is from a woman's perspective, and a powerful women. I've read in the last, I guess, 3 or 4 months, I've read 3 of your books. I've read Nightingale, the Great Alone, and Four Winds. And it does strike me that you have these very courageous female leads, and I'm sure they're in all your other books too. But why is that so important to you to have those kinds of characters?
Well, I just think, like I just said, I mean,
Yeah.
there are so many lost women stories. When I first came across the stories in the Nightingale, the true stories that inspired me, as well read as I am and as immersed as I am in history, I didn't know these stories of what the women of the French Resistance were doing,
Mm-hmm.
and how they were sort of putting their life on the line on a daily basis. And many of them ended up, being killed for their efforts, or going to concentration camps. And so I just felt that, with all that we knew about World War II, and with all of those conversations that are going on regularly, that women deserve to be a part of that conversation. And I think that's true. We're looking at this now with all groups of people, and I think we're understanding now a little bit more the value of deeper, richer stories that we haven't heard before, starring other groups of people.
Yeah. How do you pick the time periods? Because your books are really epics, and it's like time travel with your books. You really take people to a certain era. Nightingale, we go to the French Resistance and World War II, and it's just incredible. Like, you're not French, you never lived at that time. You so recreate that world. Like I said, it's like stepping, I think, it's really like getting in a time travel machine. And I'm wondering first how you decide kind of what period. Are you a big student of history, and how do you sort of decide, does setting come first for you, or time and setting come first and then you think of the story, or like what's the order of how you conceive of these books?
The thing about having written 24 books is there's a different order, there's a different journey every time. As a writer, and I think most of us would say, you never know what's going to strike you,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's going to be a magazine article, or a place that you're going, or a place that or a place, you never know what's going to hit. But I would say that with regard to sort of the way that I immerse the reader in the time and place, I think actually, and this is weird, but I think actually it's because I grew up as such a huge fantasy and sci-fi reader,
Mm.
and so I have always loved other planetary world building, world building of sort of imaginary worlds. And I think I tried to do that same level of recreation, only with, real time and places.
Right. Like you're a big Lord of the Rings fan, right? I think I
I
read.
am. Harry Potter,
So it's
Stephen
interesting.
King.
But you don't write necessarily those kinds of books where you're creating real fictional worlds. You like to go into real worlds and then recreate them, right?
Right.
Somewhat. Have you ever thought about writing fantasy type
Yes.
books? You
Yes.
have.
I
Yeah.
suspect I will at some day. The thing about fantasy, or that strikes me, is that you have to have that idea.
Hmm.
My books they don't require a unique and wildly original beginning, and and something is there for me to work with the historical or contemporary record.
Yeah. Are you a Game of Thrones fan?
Oh yeah.
I would imagine you are. Yeah, that's a good world building.
Oh yes. I just
um,
love epic stories of any kind, anywhere, really.
yeah, I do too. And I love, so, okay, so a little, you say your process is different for each book but like for a book like Four Winds or a book like The Nightingale, where you really are at a different time and place, do you just immerse yourself in how do you research books like that?
Well, so there's a slight difference. The Nightingale, like I said, the genesis of that was the real life story of a woman who started the first exit route, or one of the first exit routes out of Nazi occupied France. She was a 19-year-old Belgian girl.
Hmm.
So when I read her story, I decided, okay, these stories need to be told. And then I immersed myself in, you know, all of the various things that women were doing during that time period. And I also had to become very quickly a student of the sort of geopolitical landscape of the war in Europe, and how all those things were going, and then also study France and the French, which I didn't really know anything about, and I
You don't
had
speak
never been
French.
there.
Yeah.
So no, sadly I had to
You
go
hadn't
on
even
a
been
research.
there.
I had to go on a research trip, yeah, for the
Oh, I'm so
Nightingale.
sorry.
I
That
know
must
it
have been
was
horrible.
awful. And then for the Four Winds, it was more this this quintessential American story, this story of the Depression and the Dust Bowl and the migration west, which was this sort of iconic American journey. And the idea was to tell it from a woman's perspective. So then it was much more a journey for me to create the woman that I wanted to tell that story, because I didn't actually have any woman's memoirs, any specific woman whose story inspired me. It was more the history itself that led with that novel.
What was interesting about Four Winds is that she, Elsa, is part of this family that's Italian, like an immigrant family. She's not Italian, but she marries into this family. And I thought that's an interesting twist, because you don't really think of, like, when you're thinking about like immigrants in the 1930s in Texas, you might not necessarily
Yeah.
think of an Italian family, you know? And I thought that was a nice twist. And how did you come up with that idea?
Well, really, what I was trying to do in my head was to sort of juxtapose the classic American / European immigrant story of the early 20th century. So these people who came from Ireland or Italy or Germany or Russia, and came to America looking for land that they could own and homestead, and sort of this new way of life for themselves, and how they were welcomed, and and came into the fabric of America, but depending on where they were from, they were more or less accepted at that time. And the Italians and the Irish at this time in America were less accepted. And so I just sort of liked, juxtaposing that story with the story of the Americans who went west and found very little welcome in California.
Are you the kind of writer that does a very extensive outline before you start writing, or are you kind of that El Doctro where he says like just whatever in the whatever the front view mirror, whatever the headlights?
No, I am totally not the fly by the seat of your
Okay.
pants girl, but I am also not a big outliner. For the first like 10 years of my career, when I was an at-home mom and I had a small child at home, then I did really extensive outlines because I had no time to waste. When it was nap time, I had to sit down and I had to be productive. So I had to know exactly what I was going to do, every day. But as my books have gotten bigger and as my time has become basically my own, I find that what I do is I do about a year's worth of research, general research. At this point, I have a pretty good idea of what I'm looking for, and it's a general knowledge and a specific detail. Those are the two things that I'm looking for, as I research. And
what do you
I'm
mean a specific detail?
Yeah, those are the things that really make the book. Like, there's that scene in The Four Winds where the wind hits and the centipedes crawl out from the walls and down from the ceiling, and that they've been hiding there. And I found that in a woman's memoir, and I thought that's just the coolest thing ever. I've got
you have some great details, like birds falling out of the sky. And there was another one where like they cut the cattle open and sand comes out of the cattle, right? Like, so that's what you mean, like those kind of really specific.
Because as a writer, I mean, that's one of the fundamental rules. Specific. You don't say tree, you say pine tree if you can. And because again, that comes back to world building. It comes back to how I present this world for the reader to create in their mind. And the more specific I am, the better that the reader sort of imagines the world themselves.
So in your outlines, you're so good at building suspense. I noticed that's one thing you're really good at, which, you're very good at getting people to keep turning those pages.
Yeah, I tried.
Yeah, you try. Is that something you're very aware of when you're building it? Like, I'm going to introduce, I was thinking that, like, I was reading The Great Alone, and like you set up, something terrible is going to happen at the end of that book.
Yes.
Because like the father is kind of crazy.
Yeah.
And he keeps getting crazier and crazier. And, everybody, and you just know it. And, but you build the suspense. Like I was like, oh, what the hell's going to happen? I got to get through this. So is that something that you always think of? Like, how do you do that? Is there a technique to that other writer that you can impart?
There is actually. I mean, all of this, that's the great thing about writing is it's learned. Mm-hmm. You can learn it. And you can, sort of continually get better. And I think that particular component of this suspense that's in my work and this, I have to see what happens next. This is something I learned after writing 20 books. Mm-hmm. And I learned it from watching Game of Thrones and Breaking Bad. Oh, wow. Because I watched I can't remember what season of Game of Thrones, but I was watching these shows at the same time, and you can't look away. And at the end of every episode, some new terrible thing happens, mm-hmm. and you find yourself, you just can't wait to see what's going to happen. Right. Even if that terrible thing was completely unexpected and nobody's fault, it still sort of ratchets it up. And so what I try to do is, create this sense at the very beginning that there's something bad going to happen. Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, World War II, all you got to do is open in 1939, so that suspense is built in. But like in The Great Alone, I open, right off the bat with this father is, a Vietnam vet suffering from undiagnosed PTSD, and he is barely hanging on, and he's got a violent streak. So I take that man with his wife and his 13-year-old daughter, and I have him decide that living off the grid in Alaska is a great idea.
Just a great idea.
You just know that it's
that's
not going to be, a great idea. And so, same with the Four Winds, the history tells you this is a really tough time. So the question is, how bad is it going to get? And, the way I write books, the answer is worse and worse.
It's just going to keep getting worse. Yeah.
And I do that because I believe that adversity reveals and forms character. And so the more difficult situations your characters are put in, the more they have to make choices that reveal who they are and change the course of their future.
Do you do character sketches before you even start putting them on paper? Because I think I've heard that in sort of novel writing classes, try to write a little bit about each character, like who they are, where they go to school, what are they like? What are they not like? Because your characters are so fleshed out. I'm just wondering if you think about that before, or do they sort of evolve as you're writing? Or do you have like a general idea of who they are?
I don't do the deep character bios. I used to do that in the beginning of my career, the old days. But the reason I stopped doing them was, as I was building them in my head without ever actually writing, I was giving them way more characteristics than any single character could ever use in a book. So they become not just complex, but complicated and not cohesive. And so I would spend all this time creating them, and then I would write one scene and I would see who they actually are and go on. So now I kind of do, I guess, like a thumbnail sketch, like Elsa would be, this is a woman with really, really low self-esteem who's been told that she's worthless. And her journey in this book, her arc, is to find her voice and become a warrior. And I'm continually, as I write drafts and as I write versions of the book, I'm continually tweaking and redoing her character as I see what it is I need for her to be.
Yeah. And it's a great character, just as all your characters really, they're really moving, and they seem very well thought out and very deep, and they have a lot of levels. Do you have a routine? I mean, 24 books, it's pretty impressive. I haven't even written really one yet. I mean, I've written a bunch of books that will never see the light of day. I'm a journalist by trade, but how do you do that? I mean, you must be pretty disciplined about your routine. You mentioned that you for a year you just research, but when you actually sit down to write the book, do you have a kind of ritual?
John, for me, it's a job. I mean, that's the best way to put it is, I'm passionate about it. I love doing it. I have been, incredibly lucky to have found a job that I would do no matter what. I would do while I was practicing law or whatever. But the fact is, it's a job. And so when I'm in my work mode, when I'm at the time when I'm supposed to be creating, and I'm very disciplined about it, I get up at 7, I run an hour, and then I work from 8 to 4, 5 days a week.
Wow.
I stop for lunch. And the thing is, I don't, I can't say I don't ever, but I very, very rarely allow myself to enter the realm of, I don't feel like working today. I'll do it occasionally if something just isn't coming, because I feel like my subconscious is telling me, you're just going to waste time. But for the most part, whether I feel like it or not, whether I like what I'm writing or not, I sit down and I write.
Do you give yourself like I have to write a certain amount of pages, or is it just whatever comes in that time period?
You know, if I don't write 5 to 6 pages a day, when in that time period, I don't feel very good about the day. And if I write like 7 pages a day, I feel on top of the world. So, you know, I don't, it's not like I can sit there for 8 hours and write 2 paragraphs. I would rather sit there and just write a description of the farm for 5 pages, and hope that something comes to me in that time period rather than walk away or give up.
Yeah. Can we talk a little bit about your origin story? Because
Like a
because we like a good
superhero.
origin stories, right? You were born the daughter of a prince, but you were, but you were banished to a,
Yes.
no, that would be fun. But so you didn't start off as a writer. I was interested. I heard an interview you saying that you never really even wrote that much when you were younger or in college. You actually were a lawyer or were training to be a lawyer. You were a big reader, right? And you've already mentioned that you love Lord of the Rings and all these fantasy books. So tell us how you made this transition from this track of being a lawyer to being a writer.
Well, so it's kind of a two-pronged story. The first moment of change happened when I was in law school. I was in my third year, so final year of law school, and my mother was dying of breast cancer. And we were having a conversation one day, about my law school and how unhappy I was in my corporate tax class. And my mom said, "Don't worry about it. You're going to be a writer anyway." And it was a stunning statement because, like I said, I had never written a short story. I had never taken a creative writing class. I went to one. I took one writing class at the University of Washington, and they said on day one, "You'll have to read your work aloud." And I just said, "I'm out," walked out, and, never wrote anything. And so my mom and I decided somehow to write a book together.
Oh, wow.
And so we immediately, of course, started arguing about what kind of book to write. And I wanted to write horror because, this was the Stephen King era. And I mean, I still love his work. And she wanted to write historical romance. And so my mom won. And I started researching this romance book. I had never read one. And so I started reading historical romance, and I started researching this book that we were going to write. And I didn't actually want to be a writer. I was doing this to entertain my mom and
Right.
to, have these moments with her. And so after she passed away, I just put everything in a box and left it there, and finished law school and started practicing law, and was going on with life, until I got pregnant with my son. And I was bedridden had to stay in bed for 6.5 months. And there was nothing to do. I mean, there was, The Price is Right was on TV. There was nothing to do, no internet. It was the beginning of computers even. And so I dragged out that book, that box of material for my mom, and I thought, okay, I'm going to write a novel. And how hard can it be? And so I just dove in and started writing.
That's amazing. I think I had the opposite. Well, maybe like most Jewish boys, I told my mom I wanted to be a writer, and she said, "You should be a lawyer." I have the opposite trajectory as you. But it's interesting that in relationship with your mother, there's a lot in your books about daughter mother relationship. That's a topic that you really like to mine, right?
Yeah, I think that to date, it's the fundamental loss of my life. And it sort of shadows me. And every decade it reemerges in a new way. You know, when I had my son and when I got married, I missed her, you know, as being a part of the big events of my life. And then later on, I missed her for the advice that she could give me as I got older. And lately, I guess, and starting at about the time I wrote Firefly Lane, I began to really miss the fact that I didn't know who she was as a woman. So I
Hmm.
just keep kind of trying to discover her as a therapy kind of thing in my own writing.
Oh, it's beautiful. Um, do you the men sometimes in your books are kind of jerks. I guess you sort of have to have, but you're not anti-man, and you do have strong men.
No,
Are
I
you
mean, I think actually it's pretty rare that I have bad guys of any kind, bad women or bad men.
right?
There was, you know, there was a bad guy or villain, I suppose, in The Great Alone. Um, and I don't know if, I mean, I
Yeah,
guess
maybe I'm
Elle
thinking of
just,
that one. Yeah, I'm thinking of The Great Alone the most because
yeah,
he's kind of a bad guy.
he was kind of
But
a villain.
alcohol, yeah, he's kind of a bad guy. But he was an alcohol. I mean, he was also a sad. He wasn't
Yeah,
just a flat one-dimensional bad guy. I mean, you understood he was a prisoner of war and he was
right.
an alcoholic. Alcoholism, I also noticed, plays that's something that you write about a lot. Is that how come?
Yeah, it's funny. I didn't really know what all my themes were when I began this career of writing. So it's been this thing of, I think, in a way, discovering what I'm interested in retrospect by looking back at what I've done. And
Hmm.
clearly, I'm interested in war. I had no idea. Clearly, I'm interested in PTSD. I had
Hmm.
no idea. Alcoholism. There are these issues, I think. And I think, when you look at them, they tend to be, some level of trauma related that affect your character and the people around you deeply. So, from a dramatic point of view, they really bring something to the story as well.
Yeah. Um, I feel like I have to ask this about Nightingale because you mentioned you went to France, and I know so many people who are listening to this probably read that book because it's really such a wonderful book. And did you meet, people from, like, when you're doing your research, did you actually meet people like who survived the resistance? And did you actually kind of like, how did you, when you went to France, what did you learn and see?
At that time, when I went to do my research, which was, oh gosh, 7 years ago, something like that, um, World War II in France was a very sort of closeted deal. It
Really?
was one of these things where there weren't museums about it, there
Mm,
weren't, stories about it. It wasn't out there. I think it is now, but I don't know if you've been to Germany. Germany really they put, their World War II history out there and on display in a way that France did not. So I don't
interesting.
know. I had a very difficult time meeting people who were in the resistance to talk to. I had to rely much more on memoirs and historical
So it
records.
was more for you, it was more the setting and being able to sort of
Yeah.
explain.
Well, I
Mm,
knew that so many people had been to Paris and so many people had been to France. And usually I can write a book and not like I wrote a book about World War II Leningrad, and I've never been to there, but somehow France just felt daunting. And of course,
yeah.
there was the champagne waiting for me to learn something about. So it was a pretty great trip, and I actually fell in love with France completely.
Have you been back a few times since then?
I've been back once. Yeah.
How did the French respond to that book? Like, have you gotten nice response from French people?
Um, it it was a it was a difficult process to sell the book to the French.
Mm,
They, at least at that time, I don't, it may have changed now. At that time, they were uncomfortable with an American, telling their story,
yeah.
which you can understand. But now, now that they seem to have gotten on board, and they seem to be big fans now.
So that is going to be a movie we hear with the
Yes.
Fanning sisters, which is, I can't, what a great casting.
I know, isn't it?
It's amazing. How involved are you when your books get adapted and you have a lot, like you're on a roll right now.
I am.
Congratulations. You write some great stories and you have a pretty good agent because
Yeah.
you are really, but anyway, I can't wait to see the Nightingale. I have a feeling no matter what they do, it can't be as good as the book, but I'm sure it'll be different, and fun to watch. And how involved are you in the process of like when something gets adapted to the screen?
Well, I mean, at the moment, the only thing that's made it to screen so far is Firefly Lane.
Hmm.
And
Which is on
so,
Netflix right now. Yeah.
which is Netflix right now. And then, and Firefly, they were just beginning to film when the pandemic shut them down.
Hmm.
So they're two very different experiences. But the answer is, for the most part, so far, I am involved as a resource if they need me. I helped a bit on the Nightingale script because that was a difficult script to get right.
Hmm.
And I knew that if they didn't make the two women equal, the story, it's easy in Hollywood to do the spy. It's
Yeah.
not so easy in Hollywood to do the mother protecting her children. And I really needed those stories to both be emotional and both resonate. So I was lucky that they really sort of included me in the reading process and the giving notes process. With Firefly Lane, I mean, I had conversations with the producers and the writers about what the book was about and what I felt was important in the book. But it was it's clear to me that with Firefly Lane, there are two things. There are the book and there are the series.
Hmm.
And, so the series has kind of allowed me to be a fan of my own work for the first time.
Yeah.
And so it's been, really fun. It's difficult because when you have books like Firefly Lane or The Nightingale or The Four Winds that people adore,
Hmm.
you know, it's very difficult, I think, for an adaptation to make everyone happy.
Right. I mean, the Game of Thrones people even complain, the readers,
I
right? I mean,
know.
how can you complain? It's like the greatest
Exactly.
adaptation ever. But like, what's that experience like though? You said you became a fan. Like, what's that experience like when you write something and all of a sudden, Katherine Heigl is, acting in it? And is it just, what's the experience like? Or like,
It's just, I mean, it's surreal,
yeah.
and like I said, what they do, I had the experience with Firefly of going to what's called a table read, where the
Mm.
whole cast was there and they read the script out loud, just going around the room. And that's when I really understood that these actors and these writers, were taking my material and both, trying to be true to it, but also bringing something entirely new. I mean, like Katherine Heigl's Tully isn't exactly my Tully. There are slight changes, but the way she has captured this broken woman who wants so much is just mesmerizing to me.
Mm.
And I found, I couldn't stop watching the series. I was crying by the end of it. And I just felt like, both a fan and the writer.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Have you seen the Nightingale yet?
No. Oh, it's
Oh,
not, it's not done yet.
oh, it's not done yet because I didn't know if they just hadn't released it yet.
No.
Okay, it's not even done yet. Well, all right. So in closing here, um, what's the best advice you ever got as a writer in your career, that that you've learned maybe over the years, or that maybe another peer has given you that you'd like to pass on to some of my listeners who are writers and I'm sure fans of yours? That
You know, um, I mean, this probably isn't for everyone,
Mhm.
but when I was a really young writer, I mean, I did a lot of critique groups, I did a lot of writing conferences. I still believe in that. I believe in holding yourself accountable. I believe in, sitting down and writing. because a lot of people think that you can think yourself into being a novelist. But you can't, you have to write yourself there. And so I'm obviously, as we've pointed out, a butt in the seat kind of gal.
Yeah.
But probably the best single aid I ever had was, there was a book called Techniques of the Selling Writer by Dwight Swain. And I don't know if I think it's still in print. It's a very complicated book. It's right up there, with McKee's storytelling kind of a thing, where you really have to put the time in, you have to work a little bit to understand it. But for me, the scene and sequel, I don't know what you would call it. I don't know, the way he says to write a book just spoke to me. And that was the first time that I was able to see what a book could be, and B, had a metric that I could use to judge whether my own work was working or not. And it's basically a way to make sure that your book is a combination of scenes that move the story forward, driven by conflict, and sequel, which slow the action down and allow the characters to respond to what just happened and decide how to go forward. And those were the points that really helped me.
I am so ordering that book after we get off the phone here. But also, I do think just reading through a Kristin Hannah book, like, you can learn a lot, the way you're really a craftsman at this point, 24 books in, you really get it, how to make, there's also, you have to have your talent, but as far as the way you plot and think about plot, I think it's really valuable to learn. I did say, I did not feel for one moment in the first decade that I had talent. I feel like talent is, maybe it was always there, because maybe that's why you begin to write in the first place. You're a big reader, it's somewhere in you, you have this love of words and love of story and all of that. But for me, I feel like talent is something that I earned by continuing and not giving up and asking more of myself with every single book, even now 24 books in. And putting in your 10,000 hours. At this point, you've done it long enough, right? That you become a bit of an expert. Have you started your next book?
I have not.
Okay, this is
pandemic kind of knocked me for a loop. So and the Four Winds. So I will soon. Okay.
Well, we're so excited about that. And Kristin, thank you so much for taking the time and with us. And I love the Four Winds, recommend it highly. So.
Well, thank you so much, and good luck with your own book. I'll be looking for that.
Yes, I'll let you know.
All right.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.